There is a road in Japan that no map has ever recorded. It does not begin in any village, and it does not end at any city. It winds through cedar forests and over stone bridges, past rice fields that glow silver under the moon, and along the edges of mountains that have no names. Those who have walked it say the road feels older than the country itself, older than the gods, perhaps. And on this road, long ago, there walked a man named Keiro. Keiro had no home. He had once, many years before our story begins, lived in a small valley near the sea. He had a house with a low roof and paper walls, a garden where persimmons grew heavy in autumn, and a wife who hummed while she swept the steps each morning. But the sea had taken his wife in a storm one winter, and the house had grown too quiet to bear. And so Keiro had closed the gate behind him and walked away. That had been 11 years ago. He had been walking ever since. He carried very little, a pack of worn cloth on his back. Inside it a spare robe, a small knife, a bowl of lacquered wood, and a journal in which he wrote the names of every place he had passed through. He wore a wide straw hat against the sun and the rain equally. His sandals were always in need of repair. His beard had grown long and grey, though he was not yet 50. People who met him on the road often thought him older. He did not correct them. He was not unhappy. That is important to understand. Keiro had not left his home in grief, exactly, or rather, the grief had long since changed into something else, something quieter. He walked because walking felt like the truest thing he knew how to do. Every morning the road was new. Every evening he found shelter somewhere, a farmer's barn, a temple porch, a hollow in a hillside where the earth was dry. He ate what was given to him, and when nothing was given, he ate very little. The hunger never lasted long. It was in the 43rd year of the old emperor's reign, in the month when the maples turn, that Keiro came to a village he did not recognize. This was unusual. He had walked every road in the eastern provinces 3 times over, and most villages knew him by sight if not by name. But this village sat in a valley he had not seen before, cupped between 2 hills like water held in cupped hands, and the smoke from its chimneys rose straight up into a sky, so still and clear it seemed, made of pale blue stone. He stopped at the edge of the village and looked down at it. There were perhaps 30 houses, a shrine at the far end. Its torii gate painted a red so deep it was nearly black in the afternoon light. A well in the center of the main path, with a stone fox seated beside it, one ear chipped off, its expression patient and amused. Children were chasing a dog between the houses. An old woman was laying persimmons on a straw mat to dry in the last of the sun. It looked, Keiro thought, very much like peace. He walked down into the village slowly, as he always did, letting people see him coming. A wandering traveller learned quickly that arriving slowly was a kind of courtesy. It gave people time to decide how they felt about you before you were close enough to matter. A man repairing a fence looked up and watched him pass without expression. The children stopped chasing the dog and stared. The old woman with the persimmons nodded at him as he passed, as if she had been expecting him. There was a small inn at the far end of the village, near the shrine. It was barely an inn, really, more a house where the family happened to let a room when someone needed it. The sign above the door was faded to near illegibility. Keiro could just make out the characters for rest and water. He knocked at the frame of the open door and called out the customary greeting. A girl of perhaps 12 appeared, looked him up and down with the frank assessment of the very young, and went to fetch her father. The father was a broad, quiet man named Saburo who asked Keiro only 2 questions. Where had he come from? And where was he going? Keiro answered the first question truthfully. He had come from the north, following the river road down from the mountains. He answered the second question as he always did, with a slight bow and the words simply, "Wherever the road leads." Saburo nodded at this as though it were a perfectly sensible answer, which, in Keiro's experience, only certain kinds of people did. He liked Saburo immediately. The room was small and clean. A sleeping mat rolled against one wall, a low table, a window that looked out onto a narrow garden where a single maple tree stood in the last of its color, its leaves the color of dying fire. Keiro set down his pack and sat for a while at the table doing nothing. He was good at doing nothing. Most people he had found were frightened of stillness. They filled it with noise and movement and worry. Keiro had learned in his years of walking that stillness was simply where you went when the day was done. It was not empty. It was full of everything you had seen. That evening, Saburo's wife, a small, precise woman named Hannah, brought him rice and pickled vegetables and a bowl of soup with tofu and mushrooms. She set it before him without ceremony and was about to leave when Keiro thanked her and asked, as he always asked in new places, whether there were any stories told about this valley. Hannah paused. She looked at him in the particular way that people look at you when you have asked the exact right question at the exact right moment. She sat down across from him. She folded her hands in her lap and she said, "There is one story, but it is not the kind of story people tell at meals. It is the kind of story people tell at the end of the night, when the fire is low and the children are asleep and the dark outside the window is very complete." Keiro looked at her. He said, "I can wait." After the dishes were cleared and the house had grown quiet and Saburo had gone to check on the animals and the children had been put to bed, Hannah came back to the room and sat down again. The lamp between them was small and its flame barely moved. Outside, the maple tree was a black shape against a dark blue sky. The village was silent except for the distant sound of water, a stream somewhere below the hill, running over stones in the dark. Hannah said, "A long time ago, before this village was here, before even the shrine was built, there was a monk who lived alone in the forest above this valley." She paused. Not a monk exactly. A man who had once been a monk but had left his monastery for reasons no one now remembers. He lived in a hut he had built himself, very high up on the hillside, just below the place where the trees give way to bare rock. He had been there so long that the forest had grown around his hut, like a closing hand. His name was Muen. "It means," she said, "the one who is unconnected." He had given himself this name when he left the monastery. He grew his own vegetables on a small terraced plot and ate the mushrooms and berries that grew in the forest and drank from a spring that came out of the rock just above his hut. He did not come down to the valley. He did not speak to people. This was many generations ago, before anyone now living was born, but people still remembered him, or rather they remembered the idea of him, the way you remember a dream that left an impression, even after the details have faded. What people remembered most about Muen was not that he was strange or frightening, though he was certainly strange. What they remembered was that on certain nights, and only on certain nights, a light could be seen moving among the trees above the valley. Not a lantern light, nothing so ordinary as that. A light that was blue-white and steady and did not flicker even in wind. It moved slowly, as if carried by someone walking without any hurry. It would appear at the tree line and move along it for a time, and then vanish back into the dark of the forest. The old people of the valley had watched this light for generations. Parents showed it to their children the way they showed them the moon. "There it is," they would say. "That is Muen walking." And the children would watch it move in its slow, unhurried way and feel, though they could not have explained why, a strange kind of peace. As if the presence of someone walking so slowly, so quietly, so alone and so content, was itself a kind of reassurance. as if it said without words, the world is old and the night is large, and someone is always awake and walking, and that is enough. Hana stopped speaking. The lamp flame had not moved the whole time she was talking. Keiro sat with his hands around his empty soup bowl and looked at the table and thought about Muen. He thought about a man who had walked away from everything, even further than Keiro had walked, who had gone so far up into the silence that he had become part of it, who had kept walking even so, even alone, even at night. He asked Hannah what had become of Muen. She said no one knew exactly. One spring, the light did not appear. Not that night, not the next, not in the weeks that followed. People went up to look. They found the hut, still standing, the garden still neatly tended, the spring still running. Inside the hut was a sleeping mat, a small clay pot, a worn robe folded with great care, and a single sheet of paper on which was written, in a hand so fine it seemed, made of the thinnest possible ink, one line. He had written, "I have gone a little further." Keiro slept deeply that night. He did not dream, or if he did, the dreams left nothing behind them. He woke before light to the sound of the stream below the hill, still running over its stones in the dark, faithful as breathing. He lay still for a moment and listened. The maple tree outside his window was a grey shape in the earliest light. In the distance a bird made one sound and then was quiet. He rose and folded his sleeping mat and packed his few things with the care he always gave this task, taking a quiet pleasure in the order of it. Then he sat for a while at the low table and opened his journal and wrote the name of the village, which he had learned was called Yamazato, meaning mountain village, and beside it he wrote the name Muen, and beside that he wrote the one line from the paper in the hut. He had gone a little further. He left before the household woke, as was his custom. He left a small coin on the table, more than was needed, less than would embarrass. He stepped out into the cold blue hour before dawn and stood for a moment in the empty path of the village, listening to the stream, watching the sky. The stars were still out. The mountains to the east were dark shapes against a darkness only slightly less dark. He looked up at the hillside above the village. The forest was still, the trees barely visible, the bare rock above them lost in shadow. He stood and looked for a long time. He was not sure what he was looking for. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps just the particular quality of attention that comes from knowing a story about a place, the way a landscape changes when you know its name. He turned and walked. The road led south, out of the valley, and along the river and toward a range of low hills he had not yet crossed. The morning light was coming slowly, filling the sky from below with the pale grey that comes before colour. His sandals made a soft sound on the path, his breath made small clouds in the cold air. The stream ran beside him for a time and then curved away to the east. He was, he knew, simply a man walking on a road in the early morning. He had no particular destination. He would arrive somewhere by evening or he would not, and either way was fine. He had learned in 11 years of walking that the road was not a problem to be solved. It was simply what was there, and what was there was always and without exception enough. He thought of Muen, walking his line of blue-white light along the tree line above some valley in some century-long past. He thought of the slowness of it, the patience, the way a light that does not flicker says something to the dark that a flickering light cannot say. He put one foot in front of the other, and then again, and the road went on beneath him, pale and quiet and very old. And let your own road grow quiet now. Let your thoughts slow to a walk. There is no hurry. There is no distance left to cover tonight. You are still. You are warm. The dark outside is large and old and full of mountains that have no names, and somewhere in that dark a light moves slowly through the trees. It has been moving for a very long time. Chapter 2: The Village of the Bell with No Name. Keiro had been walking for 3 days through a forest of cedar and pine when he heard it. Not a sound exactly, more the memory of a sound, the way a bell leaves something in the air after it stops ringing. He paused on the path and stood still and listened. The forest around him was silent except for wind in the high branches. And then, faintly again, a tone so low it was almost below hearing, felt more in the chest than in the ears. He adjusted his pack and walked toward it. The forest thinned after another half-hour of walking, and he came out onto a hillside above a narrow valley. Below him, perhaps 100 houses clustered around a river that caught the afternoon light and held it in long silver pieces. At the center of the village stood a temple, its roof curved upward at the corners in the old style, its walls painted white between dark timber beams, and hanging from the gate of the temple, half hidden by the branch of an enormous camphor tree, was a bell. Even from this distance, Keiro could see that it was very old. The bronze had gone green with age, and the surface was covered in characters he could not read from where he stood. He came into the village as the light was failing. A woman hanging washing on a line outside her house watched him pass with the careful neutrality of someone who has seen many travelers and trusts none of them yet. A group of old men sat outside a tea house playing a board game with smooth river stones, white and black, arranged on a grid scratched into a flat piece of wood. One of them looked up at Keiro and said, "The inn is at the end of the main path, past the temple." Keiro thanked him and walked on. The inn was run by a man named Genzo, who was perhaps 70, and moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who has long since stopped hurrying and found life considerably improved as a result. He showed Keiro to a room that smelled of old cedar and river damp and asked him if he would eat with the family. Keiro said he would be grateful. Genzo nodded and left. Through the window, Keiro could see the temple gate and the bell hanging there in the last of the light, absolutely still, the camphor tree breathing slowly around it. At dinner there were 4 of them at the low table. Genzo, his daughter Tomoe, who was perhaps 30 and had the look of someone who had decided long ago that most things were less interesting than her own thoughts, her young son Hideo, who ate with great concentration and said nothing, and Keiro. They ate rice and grilled river fish and a soup made from burdock root. The food was simple and very good. Outside the river made its continuous sound, low and even under everything else. It was Hideo who asked about the bell. He asked without looking up from his bowl, as children ask questions, assuming the world exists primarily to answer them. He said, "Do you know the story of our bell?" Keiro said he did not. Genzo looked at his grandson and then at Keiro and said, "It is a strange story. Most of our stories here are strange. It is that kind of valley." Keiro said he had found that valleys often were. Genzo smiled at this and refilled Kiro's cup and began. "Many hundreds of years ago," he said, "this temple was built by a monk whose name has been forgotten. Not lost exactly. The monk himself erased it. He came here from somewhere in the west, built the temple with his own hands over the course of 7 years, planted the camphor tree which was then a sapling and is now, as you have seen, enormous, and hung the bell which he had cast himself from bronze he had gathered and smelted alone. When the temple was finished, he gathered the few villagers who had watched him work and told them that he was giving the temple to the valley. He said they could use it as they wished. They could pray there or not pray there. They could ring the bell or let it hang. He had built it, and now it was theirs. One of the villagers asked him what the temple was called. He said it had no name. Another asked what the bell was called. He said the same. A third asked what they should call him, the monk who had built it. He said that his name was his own business, and they should not trouble themselves with it. Then he bowed and walked away into the forest and was never seen again. And so the temple has stood here for all these centuries with no name, and the bell hangs there with no name, and we ring it at dawn and at dusk because it is a good bell and it deserves to be rung, and we have never given it a name because it never asked for one. Keiro sat with this for a while. Outside, the bell made no sound. The river made its sound. The boy Hideo had fallen asleep at the table with his head on his folded arms, his breathing slow and even. Tomoe lifted him carefully and carried him away without disturbing the conversation, as if this were something she did every evening, which perhaps it was. Genzo poured more tea and said, "What do you think of that?" Keiro said he thought it was a story about a man who understood the difference between making something and owning it. Genzo looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "I have told that story to many people over many years. You are the first person to say that. Most people say it is a story about humility." Keiro said he thought humility was perhaps another word for the same thing. Genzo considered this and then inclined his head slightly, which Keiro took to mean he found it acceptable if not entirely convincing. In the morning, Keiro woke before dawn to the sound of the bell. It rang 7 times. Slowly, the sound spreading out across the valley in widening rings the way water moves when you drop a stone into it. Each tone lasted a long time after the strike, fading so gradually it was impossible to say when it had finally gone. He lay on his mat and listened and thought about the monk who had built a temple and given it away and erased his own name. He thought about what it would mean to make something so completely that you could leave it without looking back. He rose and packed his things and went down to the river to wash. The water was very cold. The sky was the color that comes just before color, that particular gray that is not quite light and not quite dark. On the far bank, a heron stood in the shallows with the absolute stillness of something that has decided the world can wait. Keiro watched it for a while. It did not move. He went back to the inn and found Hideo sitting on the step outside the door, eating a rice ball and watching the morning arrive. The boy looked at Kiro's pack and said, "Are you going already?" Keiro said yes. Hideo said, "You just got here." Keiro said that was true of every place he had ever been. Hideo thought about this for a moment, rice ball in both hands, and then said, "That sounds lonely." Keiro said sometimes it was. Hideo nodded as if this were a satisfactory answer and went back to his rice ball. Keiro thanked Genzo and left a coin on the step beside Hideo and walked back through the village toward the road. He passed the temple as the second ringing of the bell began. He stopped and stood in the gate and looked at the bell hanging in the camphor tree. It was larger than it had looked from a distance. The green bronze was covered in what he had thought were characters, but which he could now see were something else entirely. Not writing. Shapes. Patterns like the rings of water spreading from a dropped stone, or the rings of a cut tree, or the way sound moves when a bell is struck. He stood and looked at it for a long time. The bell went on ringing, and the sound went out across the valley, and the camphor tree breathed around it slowly, and the morning came. Chapter 3. The Ferryman Who Remembered Everything. South of the cedar forest, the land flattened into a wide plain crossed by rivers. It was rice country, The fields divided into irregular squares by low earthen banks, each square holding a mirror of water in which the sky was reflected perfectly. Walking through it at dusk, Keiro had the feeling of walking between two skies, the real one above and its double below, both of them going pink and orange at their edges as the sun went down behind the western hills. He came to the river as the last light failed. It was wide and dark and moved slowly, carrying pieces of reed and the reflections of the first stars. On his side of the river there was a wooden dock extending a short distance into the water, and at the end of the dock a small shelter made of woven rush, and inside the shelter an old man sitting on a low stool with his hands on his knees, looking at the far bank with the expression of someone who has been looking at the same thing for so long that he no longer sees it and is instead seeing everything else. Keiro called out the customary greeting. The old man turned and looked at him without surprise. He said, "The last crossing was an hour ago. If you can wait until morning, I will take you across at first light." Keiro said he could wait. The ferryman pointed to a spot under a willow tree a little way from the dock where the ground was dry, and there was a ring of stones that had clearly been used for small fires many times before. Keiro thanked him and made a small fire and ate the last of the rice he was carrying and sat looking at the river. Later, the ferryman came and sat across the fire from him. He was very old, his face creased into a permanent expression of mild interest, his hands large and still showing the strength of decades of work with poles and ropes. He said his name was Taro, which he acknowledged was a common name, and that he had been ferrying people across this river for 51 years, having taken over the work from his father who had done it for 40 years before him, and his father's father before that. Keiro asked if the work suited him. Taro said it suited him very well. He said there was no better work for a man who liked to listen. "Because people talk," Taro said, "when they cross water. Something about crossing a river makes people talk." He did not know why this was. Perhaps it was because the crossing felt like a pause between one thing and another, a moment outside of ordinary time, and in that moment things that had been held in came out. He had heard in 51 years of crossing, things that he was certain no one else in the world had ever been told. Confessions, plans, griefs. Secrets kept for decades that had suddenly become unbearable on a slow crossing of a dark river. He had heard a man confess to his wife, in a whisper he perhaps forgot Taro could hear, that he had not loved her when they married, but had come to love her so completely that the thought of dying before her was the one thing in the world that frightened him. He had heard a child tell his grandmother that he believed the moon was alive and watched over him specifically, and he had never told anyone, because he knew they would laugh. The grandmother had not laughed. Keiro asked what Taro did with all of it. All those secrets, all those confessions. Taro looked at him with genuine surprise, as if the question had not occurred to him before. He said, "I remember them. That is all. I remember everyone." Keiro asked if it was a burden, carrying all of that. Taro thought about it for a long while, poking at the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise and go out. Then he said, "No. It is not a burden. It is more like being a river. A river carries things and they pass through, and the river is not heavier for it. But also the river is shaped by everything it has carried, over time, the way water shapes stone. I am shaped by what I have heard. But I am not weighed down by it." They sat quietly for a while after that. Across the river a light moved slowly, someone carrying a lantern along the far bank, heading somewhere in the dark. They watched it until it disappeared around a bend. The river moved past them, making its low, continuous sound. An owl called from somewhere in the willows and was answered from somewhere further off, the two calls overlapping for a moment, and then each going their own way into the dark. Taro said, "You are a walker." Keiro said, "Yes." Taro said, "I have carried many walkers across this river. There is a kind of person who walks not to get somewhere, but because walking is itself the thing. You are that kind," Keiro said. He supposed that was true. Taro said, "I have wondered sometimes what the difference is between a man who walks and a man who ferries. In one way we are opposites. I stay and the world crosses me. You cross and the world stays. But I think we are more alike than different. We are both in the business of passage." In the morning the mist was heavy on the river. Taro loaded his flat-bottomed boat with unhurried efficiency, checking the pole, adjusting the rope that tied a small bundle of offerings to the bow, a piece of salt, a dried fish, a spray of cedar. Then he gestured for Keiro to step in. The crossing was slow in the mist, the far bank invisible for most of it, the world reduced to the dark water and the white air, and the sound of the pole going down and lifting and going down again. Keiro sat in the bow and watched the mist and thought about passage. Halfway across, Taro said, without preamble, "I will tell you something I have never told anyone." He paused. Keiro waited. Taro said, "In 51 years I have never lost anyone. No crossing gone wrong, no one drowned, no accident. I have crossed this river in flood and in drought and in storm, and I have come to believe, though I cannot explain it, that the river allows this because of what I carry. Not the passengers, the memories. I think the river knows that I remember everyone who has crossed it, going back through my father and his father before him. I think it knows it is not forgotten. I think that is why it lets us pass." He said nothing more after that. The far bank appeared slowly out of the mist, the reeds and the mud, and then the dry ground beyond. Taro brought the boat in with a single precise movement, and Keiro stepped onto the bank. He turned to pay, and Taro waved it away. He said, "Travelers who listen do not pay. It is a rule I made for myself a long time ago, and I have found no reason to change it." Keiro bowed, and Taro bowed, and then the old man pushed off again with his pole and moved back into the mist, and was gone, and the river went on making its sound, carrying its pieces of reed and its reflections of the morning sky, patient and indifferent, and shaped by everything it had ever held. Chapter 4. The Garden That Grew in Winter. The road east from the river crossing climbed into low mountains covered in pine. For 2 days Keiro walked through a landscape of rock and root and sky, meeting no one. On the second evening a light snow began to fall, fine and dry, settling on the pine branches without sound. He walked until full dark, and then found shelter in a small shrine built into a cleft in the rock, barely large enough for one person to sit in, with a stone figure inside so old its features had worn entirely away. He sat with his back against the shrine wall and pulled his robe close and ate the last of his food and listened to the snow fall on the trees. He came down out of the mountains on the third morning into a valley that surprised him. After 2 days of rock and pine and grey sky, he had not expected colour. But the valley floor was green, deeply and impossibly green for the middle of winter, a green that seemed to be generating its own light. He stopped at the edge of the trees and stared. Then he understood. The valley held a garden, not a small garden, an enormous one, stretching from one side of the valley to the other, divided by paths of raked gravel into sections each planted with different things. moss of many kinds, ferns, low-spreading shrubs whose names he did not know, their leaves still green and thick despite the snow that had fallen in the night and lay now in thin lines along their upper branches. Trees pruned into shapes that suggested wind and water and age, and at the center of it all, visible from where he stood at the valley's edge, a small house. He walked down slowly, following a path that wound between the sections of the garden. As he walked, he began to understand the scale of it. This had taken decades, perhaps a lifetime, perhaps more than a lifetime. The moss alone, some of it covering entire sections of ground in unbroken sheets of green and gold and silver grey, would have taken years to establish and more years to achieve this quality of stillness, this sense of having always been exactly here. There was a man working in the garden. Keiro saw him from a distance, crouching near a section of pale gold moss, doing something careful with his hands. He was old, very old, his back curved, his movements slow and precise. He did not look up as Keiro approached along the path. Keiro stopped at a respectful distance and waited. After a while, the old man said without looking up, "You can come closer. I am not a shrine." His name was Jorin. He had lived in this valley for 60 years. He had begun the garden when he was 30, which meant the garden was now 30 years older than Keiro. He showed no particular interest in Keiro's story, not rudely, simply in the way of someone whose attention is fully and permanently occupied by something else. He showed Keiro to a small room attached to the back of the house and said he could stay as long as he wished, and that there was rice in the pot and firewood beside the stove. Then he went back to the garden. Keiro stayed 3 days. He could not have explained why, except that the garden demanded a certain quality of attention that he found he wanted to give it. Each morning he rose early and walked the paths alone while Jorin slept. He came to know the sections of the garden the way you come to know a piece of music through repeated listening, each part revealing something new each time. A section of black pine sculpted over decades into shapes like crouching animals. A stone basin where water fell from a bamboo spout in a single thin thread and struck the surface below with a sound that was different in the morning from what it was in the afternoon. A low hill covered in moss so fine and even it looked from a distance like green cloth, laid over the ground by someone with a very particular idea of beauty. On the second evening, Jorin came and sat across from him and drank tea and talked. Not about the garden specifically, about time. He said he had come to believe in 60 years of gardening that the main material he worked with was not moss or stone or water or pruned pine. It was time. Everything else was just the medium through which time was made visible. The moss was 30 years of mornings. The pine was 40 years of careful cuts. The stone basin had been shaped by water for longer than either of them had been alive. He was not making a garden, he said. He was making time visible. He was making it possible to stand in one place and see, all at once, the shape of many years. Keiro asked him who would tend the garden when he was gone. Jorin looked at him with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite sadness and said, "Someone will. They always do. A garden like this finds its people. It is too interesting to be abandoned." Keiro asked how he could be sure. Jorin said he could not be sure, which was fine. Certainty, he said, was overrated. He had found it much more interesting to tend something carefully and trust that care had a weight in the world, that it left a mark that outlasted the person who made it. Whether the garden survived or did not, the 60 years of attention he had brought to it had happened. They were real. Nothing could make them not have happened. On the third morning, Keiro woke very early to frost. The garden was transformed. Every surface was edged in white, the moss and the ferns, and the pruned branches all outlined in ice crystals that caught the first pale light and held it. He stood on the path in the cold and looked at it, and thought it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in 11 years of walking, which was a considerable statement. Jorin appeared beside him after a while, wrapped in a heavy robe, holding 2 cups of tea. He handed one to Keiro without speaking. They stood together and looked at the frosted garden. After a long time, Jorin said, "It is different every morning. That is the other thing. I have looked at this garden every morning for 60 years, and it has never been the same twice." He paused. Most people think of a garden as something fixed, something you make, and then it stays, but it is always moving, always changing. The moss grows a little, the tree shifts, the light is never the same. I have spent 60 years looking at the same place, and I have never once seen it twice. He went inside then. Keiro finished his tea and walked the paths one last time. He went slowly, the way Jorin moved through the garden, with the particular unhurried attention that the place seemed to ask for. He looked at the frost on the moss and the thread of water falling into the stone basin, still falling even in the cold, and the black pine trees crouching in their patient animal shapes in the early light. Then he picked up his pack from the room at the back of the house and went out through the gate and back up the path toward the mountains. He did not look back, which was his custom, but he held the garden in his mind as he walked. The way you hold a piece of music in your mind after it ends, not the whole of it at once, but the feeling of it, the particular quality of attention it had asked of you, and that you had for a little while been able to give. Chapter 5. The Papermaker at the Edge of the World. The road east from the winter garden climbed again into mountains, and then descended through a series of narrow gorges, where the rock walls rose on either side so high that the sky was reduced to a pale strip overhead. Water ran everywhere, down the rock faces in thin silver threads, collecting in pools at the base of the walls, running along the path itself in small channels that Keiro stepped over without thinking. The sound of water was constant, layered, each thread and pool and channel making its own note, the whole of it combining into something that was not quite music and not quite noise, but something in between. He emerged from the gorges on the 4th day into a wide valley where a river ran clear and cold over white stones. Along the near bank, spread out on wooden frames to dry in the pale winter sun, were sheets of paper, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, each one slightly different in color and texture, ranging from pure white to a warm cream to a gray so pale it was almost silver. They moved very slightly in the cold air, not flapping, just breathing, the way a sleeping person breathes. Keiro stopped and looked at them for a long time before he saw the workshop, a low building half hidden by the trees at the river's edge, smoke rising from its chimney in a straight column into the still air. The papermaker was a woman, which surprised Keiro, not because women did not make paper, but because he had not expected to find anyone here at all. The valley felt so complete in itself, so self-contained, as if it had been arranged by someone with a very particular idea of how things should be, and then left alone. Her name was Saya. She was perhaps 50, her arms strong from years of working with water and fiber, her hands permanently stained a faint grey-blue from the pigments she occasionally worked into the paper. She looked at Keiro with the directness of someone who lives alone and has lost the habit of social indirection. She offered him tea, and he sat in the workshop while she worked, which she did not stop doing simply because he was there, something he appreciated. The workshop was warm from the fire under the vat, and smelled of clean water and something faintly vegetal, the smell of plant fiber broken down to its essentials. He watched her lift sheets of suspended pulp from the vat on a wooden frame, the water draining through the mesh in a shimmer, the sheet of paper left behind impossibly thin and fragile looking, though he had seen the finished sheets outside and knew they were stronger than they appeared. He asked her how long she had been making paper here. She said 40 years. She had come here as a young woman from a city far to the west, following a teacher who had since died, and had stayed after the teacher was gone because the river was right and the fiber was right, and she had found that she did not miss the city at all. Keiro asked what she meant that the river was right. She set down her frame and looked at him and said, "Paper is mostly water. The water here is very clean and very cold and has a particular quality I have not found anywhere else. The paper I make here could not be made anywhere else. It is this river's paper." She showed him sheets she had made over the years, kept in flat wooden drawers in a cabinet along one wall. Some were plain, the color of the fiber alone. Others had things pressed into them while still wet, leaves and flower petals and fragments of fabric, embedded now in the surface of the paper, visible but not raised, part of the sheet itself. One drawer held paper made from the fibers of a particular water plant that grew only in the shallows just above where the gorge entered the valley. That paper, she said, had a blue quality to it in certain lights, not a color exactly, more a quality of light, as if the paper remembered the water it had come from. Keiro stayed 2 days. On the second morning she showed him the part of the work she had not mentioned before. In a room at the back of the workshop, separate from the main space, she kept her own work. Not paper made for others, paper made for herself. She made paper, she said, the way some people kept a journal. Each sheet was a day, or a feeling, or a memory. She did not write on them. The paper itself was the record. A sheet made on a day of grief was made differently from a sheet made on a day of ordinary contentment. The pressure of her hands different, the suspension of the pulp different, the thickness uneven in ways that corresponded to something she could not articulate, but could feel. She showed him a sheet made the day her teacher died. It was beautiful, very thin in some places and thick in others, the surface slightly rough, the color not quite even. She said she did not know if anyone else would ever be able to read it, but she would always know what it said. The morning he left, she gave him a sheet of paper. It was small, folded twice, plain cream-colored, very smooth. She said she had made it that morning, before dawn, while he was still sleeping. He thanked her and put it carefully in his journal, between 2 pages near the middle. He carried it for years after that. He never unfolded it. He did not feel that it was his to read. He walked back along the river with the sheets of paper still breathing on their frames behind him, the sound of water from the gorge ahead, the smoke from the workshop rising straight into the cold blue sky. He thought about making something from a place, about work that could only exist because of where it was done, about the way a river could be inside a thing without anyone being able to explain how. He put one foot in front of the other, and the road went on. Chapter 6. The Old Man Who Collected Silences. Three weeks east of the Papermaker's Valley, the land flattened again into broad agricultural plain, and Keiro walked for days through a landscape of bare winter fields, the soil dark and turned, waiting. The sky was enormous here, the horizon so far away it seemed theoretical. He passed through several villages without stopping, not from unfriendliness, but because the walking felt good and the weather was clear and he had food enough for 2 more days, and the road was telling him to continue. He had learned in 11 years to listen to the road. He stopped at last in a village where a festival was ending. The last of the lanterns were being taken down from the houses, and the streets were littered with the debris of celebration, flower petals and scraps of colored paper and the ash of small fires. Children were chasing each other between the legs of adults who were too tired to object. He found the inn easily. It was the only building with its lights still fully on, and was given a room and ate and slept deeply. In the morning he learned from the innkeeper's wife that the festival had been for the winter solstice, 3 days of ceremonies at the shrine on the hill above the village, the purpose of which was to ensure that the silence between the old year and the new was properly observed. Keiro asked what she meant by that. She said it was complicated and that the person to ask was the old man who lived in the house at the edge of the village, near the stream, the one with the large cedar tree in the garden. His name was Iso, and he knew more about the festival than anyone. Iso was perhaps 80. He had a face like a dried persimmon, small and creased, and somehow still full of sweetness. He sat in a room that was almost entirely empty. No decorations, no furniture beyond a low table and 2 cushions and a small cabinet against one wall. The room was very clean. The window looked out onto the garden where the cedar tree stood enormous and dark against the winter sky. Keiro sat across from him and accepted tea and asked about the festival. Iso said the festival was old, older than the village, older than the shrine. It had been observed in this valley for as long as anyone had recorded anything. The core of it, he said, was a period of complete silence. On the middle night of the 3, from sunset to sunrise, no one in the village spoke. No drums, no music, no ceremony. People simply sat in their houses and were quiet together. The silence, Iso said, was the point. Not as an absence of sound, but as a presence in itself. Something that needed to be made room for. Keiro asked him how he had come to know so much about it. Iso said he had been collecting silences for 60 years. Keiro looked at him. Iso said it calmly. As a person states a fact, he had been collecting silences the way other people collected scrolls or ceramic bowls. He opened the small cabinet against the wall. Inside were rows of small objects, stones mostly, some pieces of wood, a few small clay vessels with lids. Each one, he said, held a silence. He had gathered them from particular places and particular moments. The stone from the center of a frozen lake at dawn, the wood from a forest where no birds sang for an entire afternoon in midsummer, the clay vessels sealed at the moment when a temple bell finished ringing, and the last of the sound had finally gone, and there was nothing left but what came after. Keiro asked how you collected a silence. Iso smiled for the first time, small and inward, and said that was exactly the right question, and he had been asking it himself for 60 years. He said the best answer he had found was that you did not collect a silence. Exactly. You bore witness to it. You were present for it with sufficient attention that something of it remained with you, and with that remaining attached itself to whatever object you happened to be holding at the time. The object was not the silence. It was more like a door. If you held it and were quiet yourself, and remembered, you could find your way back to it. He let Keiro hold one of the stones. It was smooth and grey and slightly heavier than it looked. Keiro sat with it in his palm and was quiet. He did not find a silence exactly, but he found something, a quality of stillness, a sense of an enormous sky over frozen water, a cold so clean it felt like a kind of clarity. He sat with it for a while and then set it carefully back in Iso's hand. He stayed 2 nights. On the last morning, Iso walked with him to the edge of the village. moving slowly with a stick, the cedar tree in his garden visible above the rooftops behind them. At the point where the path left the last house behind and became open road, Izo stopped. He said, "You carry your own silences with you, you know." Keiro asked what he meant. Izo said, 11 years of walking. That is a great deal of quiet accumulated in one person. You are, whether you know it or not, a collection. Keiro thought about this as he walked away. He thought about it for a long time. Chapter 7. The Woman Who Read the Weather. It was in the deep part of winter, the coldest weeks, when the sky stayed the color of old pewter for days at a time, and the ground was iron-hard underfoot, that Keiro came to the coast. He smelled it before he saw it, the salt and the particular cold weight of sea air, different from mountain air or river air, heavier, full of distance. He crested a low ridge, and there it was, the grey sea running to the grey horizon. The two greys almost identical, the line between them barely visible. The coastal village was built on a slight rise above the water, its houses low and solid with thick walls and small windows designed for weather. Fishing boats were pulled up above the tide line, their hulls dark with tar, their nets spread on wooden frames to dry. The village had the compact self-sufficiency of places that have always known they were on their own, that no help would come quickly across that water if things went wrong. Keiro liked it immediately. He found the inn, a building that smelled of fish and smoke and salt-soaked timber in a way that was not unpleasant, and was given a room with a window that looked directly out to sea. He sat at the window for a long time watching the water. It was not doing anything dramatic. It was simply being the sea, moving constantly in its grey way, the waves small and regular, the surface textured like hammered metal. He found it restful in a way he had not expected. He asked at dinner about the village and was told about the fishing, the seasons, the particular difficulty of the winter months when the weather made going out dangerous, and the boats sat idle, and the men grew restless and short-tempered from the confinement. He asked if there were stories. The innkeeper, a woman named Fuki with the weathered look of someone who has spent decades close to the sea, without ever quite making peace with it, said there was one person he should speak to. An old woman named Tay, who lived in the last house at the northern end of the village. She had been reading the weather for 60 years. Tay's house was indeed the last one, a little separated from the others, sitting on the edge of the rise with nothing between it and the water but a narrow path and the rocks below. It was a small house, meticulously maintained, every surface in good repair, the wood oiled against the salt air. An old woman sat outside it on a low bench wrapped in several layers of heavy cloth, looking out to sea. She did not look up when Keiro approached, not from rudeness but from concentration. Her eyes were moving slowly across the surface of the water, reading something in it that he could not see. After a while, she said, "Sit down if you like." He sat beside her on the bench. They looked at the sea together in silence for several minutes. Then she said, "Tomorrow will be clear until midday, and then cloud from the west. No rain, but cold. The day after wind from the north. Strong, boats should stay in." She said this without particular emphasis, as she might state any observable fact. He asked her how she knew. She said she had been watching this particular piece of water for 60 years, and it told her things. Not in any mysterious way, she added, before he could say anything, in a very direct way. The color of the water, the behavior of the birds, the particular way the clouds built or didn't build in the west in the afternoon, the smell of the air at different times of day, the sound of the waves against the rocks below the house which changed pitch with the weather that was coming. She had been paying attention for 60 years, and the sea had in return become legible to her. It was, she said, simply a language, one that took a long time to learn. Keiro asked if she had ever been wrong. She said yes, many times when she was young. Less often now. She said there was a period, perhaps 20 years ago, when she had become overconfident, when she had started to believe she knew the sea rather than that she was reading it, and in that period she had made mistakes. She had learned that the sea did not reward certainty. It rewarded attention. The moment you stopped paying attention and started relying on what you already knew, the sea changed. It was always changing. That was the thing about it. It never repeated itself exactly. You could know it very well and still find it surprising. He stayed 4 days, which was longer than he usually stayed anywhere. Each morning he sat with her on the bench and watched the sea, and she told him what she read in it. He did not try to read it himself. He did not have 60 years to give to it, but he watched her read it and found this itself instructive. The quality of attention she brought to it was something he recognized. It was the same quality he tried to bring to the road, to each new place, to each new day of walking. The willingness to look at something familiar as if you had never seen it before. The refusal to assume you knew what was coming. On the morning he left, the weather was exactly as she had predicted 3 days earlier, clear and cold with cloud building in the west. He stood at the end of the path above the rocks and looked at the sea for a while before turning inland. The water was the color she had said it would be, a particular dark grey-green that she had told him meant deep, cold and stable air. The waves came in their regular procession and broke on the rocks below and drew back and came again. He watched them for a while and then turned and walked.